John Sandbach. I'm going to do a podcast today with my fellow astrologer and student and friend, Paul Swann, and he's going to tell you about many of the different ways he approaches astrology, which are very varied and very rich. And so I'm looking forward to hearing about them myself, even though some of them I already know about. I always enjoy hearing about them again because it always brings up new aspects of the work. So, hello, Paul.
Hello, John. It's great to be sitting down with you again.
Yes.
We've met maybe, a dozen times over the past 18 months or so.
Yes.
And I think every time I've walked away from our session with a whole new rabbit hole opening up in front of me. So I'll be intrigued to see what comes out of our conversation today.
Well, even though I'm supposedly, your teacher, you've taught me a whole lot. And so you're always opening up rabbit holes for me too. As well.
That's good. Rabbit holes are good.
I love the way you stir up my mind.
Good. That's mutual. Just to locate myself on the planet, I live in just outside a tiny little village called Llanfihangel Nant Bran, which is about 10 miles outside of a town called Brecon in mid Wales. Live on a hill overlooking the village, so quite isolated, and that's absolutely how I like it. So it's a beautiful, peaceful, quiet, natural environment in which to allow my mind to roam celestially.
That's wonderful.
And it does do a lot of roaming. One of my challenges and gifts probably is that I have Jupiter in Gemini in the 9th house. So my mind is very active and it's always seeking and searching for new avenues to explore. And eventually all of that searching brought me to you. It was a circuitous route. I was a member of at least 2 mystery schools before I became your student. And I'm really happy with what I've learned from you. I think what intrigues me about being your student is that it seems as if you have an innate ability to teach from another dimension. That's really cool. And I think I've seen something in your chart. There's something in the circular temple that makes sense of that. So I'm sure it's a thing. So talking of the circular temple, as you know, I'm delighted to be involved in helping to edit it at the moment, hopefully for a large scale publication, because in my mind, it's the most fantastic, wonderful oracle that there is. And I think it's sadly under-recognized at the moment. So it would be great if more astrologers looked into the circular temple. And also it would be great, I think, if you and I and those who are working with us and alongside us can produce a kind of a definitive version of the circular temple, because there's one on Kindle, there's the 2-volume hard copy version, which is probably the most extensive version at the moment. And as we've discussed, it would be great to have something that a large publisher felt there was a market for. I'm quite sure there is a market. And I get the feeling that it's really going to fall into place at the right time. So one of the things I like to do when I do readings, just to be upfront, I haven't done many readings. I am a student. I'll always be a student. And I kind of, at this stage, regard myself as more of an experimental astrologer. I like to experiment with different techniques. I like to do the research to back it up as well. But yeah, experimenting with different techniques is something that keeps my Jupiter in Gemini in the 9th house mind active.
Yes.
But when I do sit down with a client, the very first thing that I do is to read them a section from the circular temple that I've divined by using a system of cards. So the night before the reading, I'll draw a number of cards which will guide me to a particular degree in the circular temple. So I haven't done that today, but it's, as you know, a full moon in Capricorn at the moment. My own moon is in Capricorn, so it feels quite a strong, potent moon, this one. So I thought I'd read a section from 22 Capricorn in the circular temple, the overall degree title for which is Complete Openness to Immediate Potentials. So that's a really lovely title for the degree. And people who are familiar with your work will most likely have heard of you through the Chandra symbols, which are gradually becoming more popular. People are hearing more about them. As you know, Elias Lonsdale has published a number of books which use the Chandra symbols as a basis. So the Chandra symbol for 22 Capricorn is a bare altar covered with black velvet. And it reads, "You're receptive to the highest and clearest energy to which you can attune. You have the ability to create empty spaces whose vacuum draws in new energy. You're acutely aware of how basic assumptions and things we take for granted can block the inflow of new energy and inspiration. Consequently, you're always trying to create a space that is clear, a kind of landing pad for visitants. This can require a lot of waiting and patience, but as the corresponding Omega symbol shows us, every moment contains sweetness to be savoured." And the Omega symbol is sugar falling slowly through a giant hourglass. Now, what I particularly like about this degree is the Omega Oracle, which is a fairly lengthy section in this case, but it goes into some depth to describe the meaning of the Omega symbol. So I'm going to read that virtually word for word. And it starts, "The sacred mountain of Sukra is located in the far wastes of the northern plains. This mysterious peak forms and disappears during a 28-day period synchronized with the moon. At the moment of the new moon, a stream of sugar begins falling out of the sky and continues to do so for the next 14 days. This stream of white granules continues to fall no matter what weather conditions prevail in the area, eventually creating a massive hill that mysteriously casts no shadow. The sugar is sweet to the taste and dissolves in the mouth, but it is impervious to rain, staying completely dry, even in the most torrential downpours. At the moment of the full moon, the sugar begins to ascend in a stream back into the sky and continues to do so for the next 14 days until the mountain of sugar has disappeared, every single grain of it having been drawn back up. Over the centuries, religious pilgrims have carried away a great amount of this sugar, but the mountain is never diminished, the sugar seeming to have an inexplicable way of replenishing itself. It's been found to be utterly nourishing, does not rot the teeth, and in fact, pilgrims have been known to live off it solely for extended periods of time. Serapis has written that this mountain, referred to by some as the fountain of the moon, is actually the bottom of an immense and invisible hourglass. He cites as proof of this that those who consume the sugar over time become increasingly freed from the power of thoughts of the past and future to enslave the soul, thereby eventually becoming liberated into the joys of each passing moment. So I think that's a wonderful oracular story. And when I'm reading for people, I just love to kick things off with something along those lines, because I think it's useful to kind of blow people's expectations of what the reading is going to be out of the water right from the start.
That's good. Yeah.
Because you're straight away taking them into a very subjective world. And a reading like that will ring bells for each person in very different ways. And the bells that it rings provide a hook on which to develop a conversation. And very often I find that those conversations lead us into quite unexpected areas. So I wonder if you remember anything about when you produced that oracle and what kind of meaning you ascribed to it.
I do remember writing that, and I remember that it happened very, very quickly, that the image came to me quickly, and then the writing was only, a very short time.
Mm-hmm.
And so it felt like it was at least partially channeled.
Yeah.
And I think a lot of, what I do is channeled. I think a lot of what all of us do is channeled.
Each in different ways. And I can say that by using
yes, exactly.
a particular temple, it helps me to channel or to intuit where to take a conversation.
Yes.
Yeah.
And that's exactly what I wanted to do. That is so good to hear.
Yeah.
That makes me very happy to hear that.
Yeah. And I think just continuing on this theme of the circular temple for a moment, I think the more time you spend immersed in its visions and its world, and it's very otherworldly.
Yes, it is.
I mean, it's kind of an alchemical text, isn't it?
Yes.
So the more time you spend in it, certainly you find that synchronicities increase. And you just attune to that different world more closely. And then you find that maybe the circular temple starts turning up in your dreams. And certainly my friend Nicola, who uses the circular temple a lot, is very often able to correlate things that are happening in her life with sections of the circular temple and dreams that she has. I mean, this morning she had one, for instance, and it can be very, very kind of startling what the correspondences are.
Yes.
So, yeah, it's a wonderful magical document.
Yeah, that's wonderful to hear. Elias Lonsdale, I read something recently that he wrote that really resonated with me. And it was talking about alchemical texts.
Mhm.
That's what he was mentioning. And he was talking about how they're not meant to be figured out.
Yeah.
They're not meant to be intellectually understood. What you're supposed to do with them is to get in tune with them.
Yeah.
Is that when you get in tune with them, then you get in tune with that energy, and then that helps to let whatever needs to happen.
Sure. Yeah.
In other words, it's like it clears the way for evolution or
Mhm.
for the raising of consciousness. And that just meant a lot to me because, I have Mercury in Gemini, and I think in the past I've used the intellect as a compensation device, as a kind of defense mechanism, clinging to it.
Sure.
And the older I get, the less intellectual and the less rational I become, and the better it feels.
Yeah. Yeah. And of course, there are several other popular oracles, the Sabian symbols being probably the most used, but there are others
Yes.
as well. And to be fair, the circular temple might not be for everyone. I think
of course not.
There are very real differences between the oracles, and it's a question of finding what works for you.
Yeah, like a lot of people use the I Ching.
Yeah, sure.
Yeah.
Maybe
just
because I'm a Pisces, but the circular temple really resonates with me on quite a deep level. So when there's another technique of yours which I really like to employ when I start to look at a chart, which I think is unique to you, and it, as we've discussed in the past, it kind of grew out of Mark Edmund Jones's planetary patterns, and some of those patterns are quite difficult to determine. They can straddle the line between 1, 2, 3 or more of the different
patterns. I was just looking at a chart yesterday that it was like that.
Yeah. But every chart has a mathematically defined space ruler.
Yes.
So to start with, I love the term space ruler, but to clarify what it means, it's the planet which has the most empty space around it. And as you've suggested, and as I find tends to work out in practice, because it has all this empty space around it, it tends to work harder to reach out to its neighboring planets. And therefore, its prominence in the chart tends to increase.
Right,
and it's an elegant and really simple technique, which for me has a rationale behind it, which sits well with me. So I like to include Chiron. So I use the 10 planets and Chiron. I don't know if you use Chiron when you calculate the space ruler.
I haven't. No, I haven't. But I think that's a good idea, actually.
Yeah, I mean, again, it's much depends on each individual's astrologer's focus, doesn't it? I mean, some of us use Chiron more than others. I have it conjunct the North Node, so it's difficult for me not to include it when I'm looking at a chart. So yeah, I think, and very often Chiron can be a very strong influence in a chart, which makes sense of things which other ways of looking at the chart may not incorporate. So I'm thinking of one chart in particular at the moment, which is heavily loaded down at the bottom of the chart around the IC. And all of the planets, in fact, all of the 10 planets are within less than 100 degrees of each other down the bottom of the chart.
Mm-hmm.
And up above the horizon is Chiron. And to me, that placement in that particular chart speaks volumes about the challenges that that person faces in this life, and also kind of maps out how they can tackle the challenges that the planets down at the base of the chart present to her. So Chiron is kind of pulling or trying to pull all of the rest of the chart up towards it. And of course,
right, it's almost like a synthesis point.
Yes, yeah. And at the same time, all of those planets, the gravity of those planets down the bottom of the chart are trying to pull Chiron down to it.
Yes.
I always like to look at different features of a chart in terms of polarities and the axis that's involved.
Yeah.
So yes, in this particular case, Chiron closely opposes Jupiter. And for me, that suggests that her path of growth and of healing lies through that avenue.
Tell me, could you say a little bit about what you see Chiron as meaning? Like, how do you interpret Chiron?
It's, I think there are, as you know, the standard or the common understanding of Chiron is associated with the wounded healer. And I do think that that is a strong archetype that's associated with Chiron. And I think it's a bit more than that as well. So recently I was reading a new book by astrologer Antero Ali called Experiential Astrology, in which he was suggesting that Chiron points to an area of self-sabotage. So I think most people tend to think of Chiron as an area where you are sabotaged, where life seems to be conspiring against you and has given you an unhealable wound. But I quite like this idea, and I'm just starting to use it in this way now, of looking at Chiron as a potential area of self-sabotage. And what I like about that is if we're sabotaging ourselves in that area, then to a certain extent at least, there are things that we can do about it just by bringing that into consciousness for a start, has got to have a healing effect, at least partially. So I'm moving away from thinking of Chiron as an unhealable wound into a place where healing can occur if we bring it into consciousness. And that the degree of healing that occurs may or may not be total. I mean, it's likely that the depth of the wound is always going to leave an echo throughout your life. But bringing in another of Chiron's focuses it has a multi-dimensional quality to it. And it's as if Chiron can travel backwards and forwards in time and bring about a healing resolution, sort of multi-dimensionally. So I like that as well. And I also like the idea of Chiron as being associated with systems thinking. And the myth of Chiron, as you know, Chiron was an astrologer. He was a healer. He was looking at things in whole systems. So to me, it makes perfect sense that having Chiron closely conjunct my North Node in Capricorn, I have a strong pull towards thinking in terms of whole systems. Always have. So I think there are different ways of looking at it, and I don't think it's necessarily hard and fast yet.
Yeah.
But it's certainly a potent placement in the chart for sure.
Yes. Well, just now, a couple of things you said really triggered some thoughts in me about it. Yeah. One thing is that I think wounds can be hidden.
Mm-hmm.
And so sometimes we can look at a person and say, oh, they have health and they have financial security and everything in their life seems stable. But gee, look, when you ask them, they say, well, they don't really feel happy.
Yeah.
And it could be because there are things that they have successfully repressed that they're not dealing with, that they've cut themselves off from to maintain a kind of outer stability in their life. And so there's a wound there, but it's been glossed over or, tucked away somewhere. And to heal that wound can mean to create chaos in their life.
Sure.
Because if they're going to delve into that wound, it can upset things. So a lot of times through healing, things get worse in the process of the healing.
And again, as you've been talking, a couple of further ideas have come to mind for me as well. So another word that I strongly associate with Chiron is the maverick, and also the outsider. I think it has both of those qualities associated with it, and I certainly feel a maverick, and I've been called a maverick.
Yes.
I kind of reveled in being called a maverick.
Yes.
And of course, another of the mavericks in the chart is Uranus.
Yes.
And many of us have the Uranus-Chiron opposition that was in place for so many decades, really. I have that myself, and I have Uranus conjunct the midheaven. So it's like I can't really avoid being seen as some kind of maverick or outsider.
Right.
And of course, that has its challenges earlier in life. But as I've studied astrology and gained a better understanding of myself through that process, I've become a lot more comfortable with this maverick persona of mine.
Yes. Yes.
And these days it's, take it or leave it. I don't mind if you don't like me as a maverick. If you do, great, then we've got things to talk about. But
yes, I always refer to Uranus as one of the two great astrological intimidators. But the intimidation coming from Uranus can be very therapeutic.
Yeah.
It can be very good for people.
Mm. Yeah.
And so you tend to get extreme reactions. Like my reaction toward Uranus in general, and you in particular, as having all that Uranus, is I'm excited to see what's going to come up.
Sure.
You know,
and we never.
Whereas some people are like, feel threatened about that. Oh,
yeah.
No, don't say anything I can't deal with. Don't bring up something I don't understand. You know, they want everything to be real set and secure, and like they know the territory, that sort of thing. And Uranus is always trying to open up the territory. You know,
it occurs to me just to briefly sort of outline the career that I eventually ended up falling into, which was in social care. So initially I did some hands-on social care work, and then decided to put my sort of managerial skills to use in the social care field, and then eventually ended up in working as a contracts officer for a local authority, and eventually became a planning and commissioning officer. So working on policy.
That's Jupiter in the ninth.
Jupiter in the ninth, but the way I went about it was quite Uranus in the 10th.
Mm-hmm.
So the beauty of the role of the policy officer is that you're trying to change things. It's your job to improve things. And within social care, certainly in this country, probably in the United States, there's a huge amount of problems in the way that social care is provided.
Yes.
So I really relished being a policy officer and going out and talking to people and holding my hand up and saying, look, I don't know anything about this. I'm paid to put an effective policy in place to improve the quality of service that this local authority provides. You're the expert, so tell me what I need to know. So I bring that kind of receptivity into it. And there's a method of, or an approach to collaborative or cooperative working. But effectively, you're working with people on an equal level playing field. Yeah.
Yes.
So if you can get people who use services in the same room and around the same table as people who provide services and who pay for services, then collaboratively, it's possible to come up with a new policy that works in practice. So I became, I think, pretty good at doing that. And allied to that was a particular interest that I had in advocacy, by which I mean providing people who are within social care systems and maybe lack the voice that they need to get what they need. So it's very easy to be kind of steamrollered in the social services system. And the advocate would come in and speak up for you on your behalf, you know, totally supporting you to get what you actually need through being heard. So I think there's something of the maverick is involved in that as well.
Oh, yeah, very definitely.
Yeah.
Is it okay to drop put your chart on the screen?
Yeah, sure.
No, the reason what occurred to me, because I didn't really remember a lot of your chart, when you were talking, it brought up the asteroid Ceres in my mind.
Mm-hmm.
Because Ceres is about nurturing, but it's against generic nurturing and for individual, unique, deep, and spiritual nurturing.
Mm-hmm.
And there you go. You have Ceres just 1 degree and 10 minutes from being in conjunction with your ascendant. And then also, your moon opposed Uranus would mean innovative Uranus, nurturing moon. So you have another nurturing sort of thing happening there.
Mm-hmm.
And then, your Venus in the 6th house, appreciating Venus, what the problem is, 6th house. So when you're going out and talking to people about what they need, that's so important and so key to the whole thing.
Yeah.
And Venus is exalted in Pisces.
And it's at the tip of the T-square from Mars to Jupiter as well.
Oh, yes. Yeah, it certainly is.
Mm.
So the Jupiter is going to understand it in the 9th house. And the Mars in the 3rd house is going to find something to do about it.
He's going to communicate about it. Yeah. So
yeah, exactly.
Like before I retired a couple of years ago, like one of the last projects that I was working on was developing an advocacy policy for a local authority in the kind of way that I've described. And it was published and is in place now. And hopefully it's improved the situation for people who need advocacy in that particular local authority.
That's great.
But that's like a lifetime ago. so I retired 10 days before the first lockdown. So March the 13th, 2020, I think.
Yes.
And soon after that, astrology came rushing back in, having been on the back burner for best part of 20 years, because the way that my brain works is that it really struggles to hold left brain and right brain together. I'm in one or the other. So when I was involved in that social care career, it was very much a left brain type focus that I had to have in order to produce policy documents and so on.
Yes.
And I just felt that if I tried to also do astrology at the same time, it just wouldn't have worked for me.
Right. Too much hopping back and forth.
Yeah. So I just had to focus in on the career in order to put the bread on the table.
Yes.
But now in retirement, I'm freed up to return to the study of astrology, which began for me at my Saturn return, the first one, when my life fell apart, my marriage collapsed, my business failed, everything fell apart. Nothing made sense until I picked up Liz Green's book on Saturn.
That sounds like what I was saying about Chiron, the way it can kind of create chaos.
Yes.
And then out of the chaos, a new order comes.
That was certainly the most chaotic time of my life, although there have been other chaotic times as well. But yeah, it can be a painful process. I'm thinking of Chiron in the 4th house, so it goes down deep. It's associated with family.
Yes.
And that's been true in my case. So lost relationships, lost marriages, lost children even. So the wound is there. So as I've mulled over Chiron as the self-saboteur, I've been wondering about my role in that, and I haven't reached any conclusions yet, but it's something I'm looking at for sure.
But do you think maybe sometimes that self-sabotage is for a higher purpose almost?
Well, there we get into the kind of philosophical background to astrology and living, really. I got onto a spiritual path very early in life. I also got onto a very political path very early in life. So as a teenager, I was studying Marx. I was selling the socialist worker at factory gates. I was helping coordinate a rebel youth wing. I was leading school children out on strike.
What I'm thinking is, since you did that really early on in your life, with that south node in your 10th house, I'm thinking that it almost feels like a continuation of what you'd been doing in a former life.
That could well be the case. I mean, the revolutionary is a very strong streak in me, and that clearly is associated with Uranus. And
yes,
I have continued to study political philosophy throughout my life until I reached the point of realizing basically I'm an anarchist. Not a Molotov cocktail throwing anarchist, but philosophically my politics are anarchist, which again is the maverick and the outsider.
Yes, I've always felt about you that you don't mind at all causing trouble if you feel like trouble is what is needed.
Yes.
If the trouble has some therapeutic benefit, you're fine with causing it.
And I kind of associate that with Eris down there close to my descendant, opposing series as well.
Yes. Now, Eris is that the little thing that's right by
looks like an anchor. Yeah, just 7 degrees Aries.
I love the myth of Eris. That's great.
Yeah. And you just described it perfectly. It's throwing that something different into the ring and stirring things up and seeing what falls out.
So that's what nature does all the time.
Yeah, sure.
Yeah.
And the way that all of this also got expressed as a teenager was through spirituality, and particularly through, well, you and I both practice transcendental meditation.
Yes.
And actually, I'm thankful to you for reminding me. I did learn TM back in the 70s.
Yes.
Didn't practice it for a long time. And then, when we started talking and you mentioned your own practice of TM, that nudged me to revive my practice. And I'm so grateful for that. It's a daily, features daily for me. I spend half an hour in meditation. That's
wonderful.
But I also, what I was drawn to at that age was the teaching and philosophy of J. Krishnamurti, who himself would be regarded as a maverick, an outsider.
Yeah, very much so. Yeah.
He of the truth is a pathless land philosophy. I went to see him a few times in Switzerland and down in Brockwood Park in Hampshire, UK, and also at the Barbican in London. So I saw him a few times and he always really impressed me, and also really kind of frustrated me, because the number of times when it felt like he was going to reveal the meaning of life, the universe and everything in the very next sentence, but then would pull back, leaving you hanging. So there was that. But then in my 20s, I got into expressing one of the shadow sides, perhaps, of the Mars-Jupiter opposition and probably other features of my chart in gambling. So I worked in betting offices in my 20s and actually owned my own betting office for a time.
Oh my, how interesting.
But as someone who also gambled, as well as running a betting office, it was a recipe for disaster. And along came Saturn return, and that put an end to all of that, thank God. But yeah, so there was the political stuff, there was the spiritual stuff, and there was also this strong pull to horse racing was what I really loved. And I still watch the big races, but I managed to kick myself of the gambling habit, which is it's a nasty habit to have. It's a very difficult one to get out of.
Yes.
So and then in my 30s, I was deeply involved actually in the early stages of the New Age movement. I was reminiscing the other day on the fact that one of the guiding fathers of the New Age movement, Sir George Trevelyan, once stayed with me when we organised one of the early holistic education conferences back in the early 80s. And I, in my mid-30s, I became very disillusioned with society and my role in it, or my lack of a meaningful role in it. And I ended up moving to live in a New Age spiritual community in the north of Ireland for 4 years. And that, I would say, is one of the times when I felt most integrated. It felt as if, I'm associating community both with the 11th house, but also to some extent, I think, with the 4th house. So there's Pluto,
yes,
in the 11th, but there's all this Chiron and North Node and the moon not far away, the 4th house focus as well. So living in community and working in community, it felt as if all the different disparate parts of my personality started coming together. But then over time, that damn outsider maverick thing got me again, because I started to feel as if my role in the community wasn't understood or valued.
What do you feel like your role in that community? What did you want it to be, or in what were they undervaluing?
Well, it was modeled on the Findhorn community. Are you familiar with Findhorn up in the north?
Oh, very much. I love Findhorn.
Yeah. In fact, Peter and Eileen Caddy came to visit us during the time I was there. So it was modeled on Findhorn. So it was a very kind of egalitarian spiritual community. Everyone practiced their own approach to spirituality and meditation. We made decisions through consensus, following an attunement. And there was a lot that I really loved about it. But over time, I was the only Englishman in the community, and its location was about 10 miles west of the Northern Ireland border, and this was pretty much at the height of the Troubles, with a lot of violence going on. And one of the purposes of the community was to provide a temporary refuge for people who were hurt and damaged psychologically or physically by, the awful time of, terrorism and British government power play. So I eventually felt very isolated within the community, even though I'd married the founder of the community, and we had 2 beautiful boys together. But living in community, the downside, I don't know, is it a downside? One of the deep challenges of living in community is that your stuff is right in your face. It's like living in a pressure cooker. There's no escaping your stuff. And I eventually found that my stuff was outweighing my love of living in community, and I blew out. And
see, that's so much like Pluto in the 11th.
Yeah, absolutely.
Because Pluto, one of the things I always feel about Pluto is very relentless. it doesn't stop pushing. It's always pushing, pushing, pushing for more transformation, for more evolution, for intensification. And it sounds just like what you're describing.
It is. Yeah, on reflection, it was a very plutonic time of my life, for sure. And Pluto in my chart has always mystified me quite a lot, because the only major aspect that it makes is to Neptune. It doesn't directly connect with the other major planets, although there is a quincunx to Chiron, which I've grown to recognize as being particularly significant.
Yes.
So yes, there was Chiron being in the fourth, conjunct the North Node, so it churned up all of that woundedness again. And I almost overnight, I went from living in a spiritual community with a core group of 9 or 10 other people on the shores of an Irish loch to living with someone in the heart of North London and a mile from the nearest tree. A really stark contrast. And inevitably, I carried a lot of that plutonic, chironic woundedness with me. And it took quite a bit to recover from that phase of my life. But it was, having said that, I cannot regret a single moment of it in any way, shape, or form, especially with the two wonderful sons that we have. So,
So when you left that community, there must have been something that you needed that you felt you weren't getting.
Yeah.
Could you say what that might be, or is it?
Well, my mind turns to Saturn, which, although it shows in the end of the first house, I kind of regard it as being more a second house feature of my chart. And in this context, then Saturn is about kind of limitation in my sense of self-worth. So that's definitely an ongoing issue for me. I mean, I'm aware that I could have been practicing as an astrologer some time ago, but have felt insufficient self-worth to put myself out there on a professional or semi-professional basis. So self-worth, I think, was probably at the core of the issues that I had at that time. And I just felt a huge impulsion to go off and find myself. I mean, it sounds strange. Most people leave society, go off to community and find themselves there. Well, to a certain extent, I did that. But then, having been there, I needed to go back into society to find another side of myself. So I ended up going into, I'd always wanted to study for a degree. I wasn't academically inclined earlier on, but I did want to study by independent study. Again, a kind of maverick approach to higher education, where you design your own curriculum.
Well, and the Uranus in 10th, I think of the 10th house as authorities.
Yeah.
And so oftentimes both you and I have Uranus in 10th. I think it can signify being your own authority.
Yeah.
That's the self-study part. And certainly my work in astrology was mainly all self-study.
Yeah.
I mean, I've learned a lot from other people, but generally speaking, it's about self-study.
So what happened to me when I went to the University of East London and its School of Independent Study. I had my interview there and was accepted. And then before I actually started, they closed down the School of Independent Study, and they scattered us out into the different departments where independent study was just totally scorned. So there were about 24 of us who started that year, and only 3 of us survived. And it was a course in survival. I would say that until that point, I had some self-doubt around my ability to see things through to the end. But that course taught me very little about what I wanted to be studying, which was originally astrology, but which turned into theories and methodologies of personality assessment, focusing in on the Myers-Briggs type indicator, which was okay, but it was just not, my heart wasn't into it.
Yes.
But I saw it through, and I came out with a piece of paper. I mean, I didn't even go to the graduation ceremony. It meant nothing to me. It was just an exercise in pure survival and proving to myself that I can achieve things and see things through to the end.
You know, when you say see things through to the end, that's like 4th house.
Yep.
And that's where your node is.
Yeah.
So I can understand why you would be drawn to seeing things through to the end as a part of your evolution.
Yeah. Yeah.
And of course, North Node is conjunct Chiron.
I think there were a number of years after that course where I was kind of free floating, just burdened with student debt and having to collect and deliver Mercedes for a dealership. I did that for, I don't know, about 3-4 years or something. And it was after that I got my first rung on the ladder of social care. So I worked as a personal assistant for a young woman with muscular dystrophy who was able to employ her own personal assistants. I was one of a small team of people who worked with her 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. And I learned an awful lot from that experience.
Well, there's many interesting things that played into your path in life.
There are, but it's, and the role of astrology is a peculiar one. It's like, I feel actually that if I had have studied astrology at university in the 90s, it's about 91 to 94 when I was at university, if I then considered myself to be an astrologer, would I have been a good astrologer? I don't think so. I don't think so. I think I needed actually to put that 20-year career in social care into my own system and to gain all the learning and education that I got from that. So that now that I am back into astrology, I've got a much deeper wealth of understanding of people, basically.
Yes.
And increasingly, as time goes by, a deeper understanding of the art of astrology.
Yes.
But as you know, there are so many enticing techniques that it can be challenging to focus in on the main ones, the ones that really work. And again, you and I know we're kind of working towards a revision of your manual of astrology.
Yes.
And I think it'd be wonderful to review your original manual and to consider, you know, some new techniques to add to what you've already produced.
Yes, that's definitely what I want to see happen with that book, so that it expands out and embraces a lot of more than what's currently there.
Yeah. And I think one of my contributions to that will be in the area of declinations, which we've talked quite a bit about. And it's one of those poorly understood areas of astrology.
Yes.
Just to explain briefly what declinations are, looking at the chart, we see the degrees of longitude that all of the planets are placed in. And all of those planets are positioned somewhere along the ecliptic. In a kind of a horizontal plane. But declinations brings in the vertical plane. So the path of the sun through the year carves out what people think of as kind of a boundary in which the sun effectively is the powerful ruler. But some planets, not all, but some planets can step outside of that boundary. And that boundary is around approximately 23 degrees, 26 minutes, both north and south of the celestial equator. So when a planet strays outside of that boundary, it's called an out of bounds planet. And the effect on out of bounds planets is that they're kind of freed up from the sun's control to be more fully themselves, perhaps in a wilder way or a more maverick way or whatever. And it certainly made a lot of sense to me when I learned about this really important secondary coordinate system, that my moon is out of bounds. It's the only one of the planets that, the main planets, that is out of bounds. Because, you know, through this conversation, we've been talking about how out there, beyond the boundaries, my life has taken me, you know?
Yeah.
And it's as if that the moon has pulled me into those kind of extreme areas throughout my life. And as you know, you have 4 planets out of bounds. And I think that reflects in, you know, your own life and your own contribution to astrology through things like the circular temple, but also through a myriad of other ways, including midpoints, harmonics, the tarot, all sorts of things. So
yes,
you know, we share this out of boundness.
Yes. Do you remember in my chart which of the planets that are out of bounds? If you don't, that's okay. I just
shall I bring up your chart? Is that all right?
Sure.
Okay. So that's you. And to find your out of bounds planets, we go into listings. And we see that down at the bottom, you have Uranus just beyond that 23 degree, 26 minute boundary. Vesta is also beyond it, and also Pluto, Mercury, and the most out of bounds is Venus.
Mm-hmm.
And to me, that quite extreme out of bounds Venus is associated with the artist in you.
Yeah, that makes so much sense.
You know, you've shared once or twice that aesthetics is something that's, in your lifeblood. It's an area of such great importance for you.
Yes, it's
And that
something I
makes
think
sense.
about all the time.
Yeah. Mercury,
Yeah.
Venus, and Pluto and Uranus all out of bounds. And that's actually rare. That's less than 1% of the population would have that.
That's interesting.
Even among astrologers, there are very few that I found, maybe half a dozen. So yeah, we're both out of bounds characters. I actually am toying with the idea that out of boundness might work in slightly different ways if you have 2 or more planets out of bounds than if you have the moon out of bounds. So it's almost as if having moon out of bounds takes a lot of other stuff out of bounds as well.
Mm-hmm.
It kind of feels like that way to me.
Well, since the moon really governs your perception, like what you take in, then it would really mean that your way of perceiving everything has a free quality that's freer than the average, than most people. So you perceive things in different ways than other people perceive them.
Sure.
Sort of thing.
For sure. So I think I'll be contributing a chapter on declinations without going into too much technical detail in it, but more showing how it's a vital technique without which it's almost as if you're looking at a chart with only half the information.
Yes.
And another area that really interests me is something that Elias Lonsdale has also worked on, which is around degree frequencies. And I know that there's a section on frequencies on your website, John.
Yes. I love that subject.
It's, and again, just to briefly explain what we mean, it's like we've got the signs, we've got the houses, we've got the aspects, we've got the degrees, and beneath the degrees are the frequencies. And we could say that there are 30 of them. So this is suggesting that a planet in, say, 10 Scorpio has something in common with a planet in 10 Pisces or 10 Gemini or whatever. So
yes, 10 of all the signs.
10 of anything, 10 of anything, or any number, 1 to 30.
Yeah, that the 10 means something in and of itself.
Yeah, yes. Yeah. So that's an area that I'm beginning to look at, and it's a fascinating area. And I've listened. I took an online course with Elias on degree frequencies, and I found that extremely interesting. And I'm trying now to work it into something practical that I can use. So frequencies is another big interest. And then there's one of the rabbit holes that you sent me down a few months ago when you mentioned in passing about your Jupiter being conjunct the galactic center.
Yes.
Down there in the 4th house. So you can see Jupiter at 27 degrees, 10 minutes of Sagittarius, and the galactic center very close, within a degree or so, at 26 degrees Sagittarius, 07. So I was already aware of the galactic center, but until you brought it up, I hadn't really investigated it or looked into it in any depth. But something made me dive down that rabbit hole, and to a certain extent, I'm still down that rabbit hole, still exploring what the galactics mean in a chart. And certainly the galactic center, probably more than any of the others, is an extremely potent part of the chart. And in effect, it's a fixed star. I mean, it's not a star. It's, there's a black hole at the heart of it.
Yes.
But it moves around the chart in the same way as a fixed star would. In other words, at about 1 degree every 72 years or so.
Yes.
So
It's a very slow movement.
Yeah. Currently, it's in 28 Sagittarius, early degrees of 28, 27 something Sagittarius, I believe.
Yes.
So the galactic center and these other galactic points, and I've scattered them around the chart. So there's one next to it, there's the great attractor at 13 degrees 14 of Sagittarius. There's the super galactic center, which is marked as MES at 1 degree Libra 20 in your chart.
Yes.
The MES stands for M87, colloquially as the super galactic center. And recently I've started incorporating the Shapley super cluster into my thinking. And that is marked in your chart there at 2 degrees 36 of Scorpio. So I'm just kind of looking into it and researching it and thinking about how these way out there galactic factors feature in a chart. So going back to the galactic center, being in Sagittarius, ruled by Jupiter, I think this gives a huge potency to Jupiter in anyone's chart.
Yes.
As you know, Jupiter is a huge planet and it has a huge role in the chart anyway. But as I've looked into it in the context of the galactic center and realizing that it is, it rules Sagittarius and effectively disposits the galactic center. So the galactic center is kind of channeling a load of energy through to Jupiter. So Jupiter's position by sign and house in the chart is crucial, I think.
Yes.
Very, very potent.
Yes, that makes so much sense.
Incidentally, the other one that's marked there is at 14 Scorpio 26, which is Philip Sedgwick, who does a lot of work on galactic astrology.
Yes.
Calls it Z/ZS, and it's the midpoint between the galactic center and the super galactic center.
Oh, that's interesting.
So these are, look at
that's conjunct my south node.
Yeah. So food for thought there, for sure.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes.
And, I mean, to be honest, I don't know what these things really mean, but it intrigues me to just look into them, look for correspondences in people's charts, and try and make sense of it and draw some conclusions from it, hopefully.
Yes. I think that's the art of astrology.
Yeah.
It's the experimentation that you're talking about. And that's what opens up new channels of knowledge.
Yeah. Yeah.
So I think it's a wonderful thing.
Yes. I'm comfortable with how I fit or don't fit into the world of astrology, in as much as I'm not driven to make a huge fortune out of astrology.
Yes.
Fortunately, I have my pension to fall back on. And, being in this position now later on in life it's opened up this more experimental approach, which I'm really reveling in. Whereas 20, 30 years ago, if I'd been an astrologer then, perhaps I wouldn't have been so experimentally oriented.
Right.
Thinking more about how to make my living from astrology.
Right.
So
I really relate to everything that you're saying. My mind now is all stirred up about these other points. I want to look at them more. I want to, yeah.
And we haven't even
Especially-
talked about the dwarf planets. I haven't included them there, but I mean, just as a matter of interest, the way that I'm working these days is my first.
So are there 7 major dwarf planets? I'm making a joke.
Roughly.
The 7 dwarfs, you know.
there actually are about that number. But this would be my first look at a chart. With most things stripped out other than the 10 planets plus Chiron. So that makes it easy to eye up which is the space ruler, for instance.
Yes.
So clearly,
yes.
Actually, I know I'd been deluding myself that Jupiter was your space ruler.
Mm-hmm.
But actually, from Mercury to Jupiter is more than from the Sun to Chiron, I think, which makes the Sun your space ruler. But as you know, I've also been experimenting with the idea of secondary space rulers. So there's absolutely no doubt that Jupiter is a huge influence on your chart, not only for the reasons we've just talked about in relation to the galactic center, but it's the only one in that hemisphere. So it's, certainly a very important planet for you.
Yes.
And then my second look will bring in some of the other stuff. And it starts looking a bit more cluttered this way, but it's still just about manageable. And I like looking at what kind of patterns emerge through the aspects and what have you. So here we've got the 10 planets plus Chiron plus the 4 major asteroids plus Sun Moon midpoint and plus these galactic points as well, and also Black Moon Lilith and Sedna, Eris, and Selena, the white moon, which I'm experimenting with as well.
Now, what is Selena?
Well, it's kind of the opposite to Black Moon Lilith. So Black Moon Lilith is when the nodes of the moon are located at their furthest point from the Earth, and Selena is at the closest point to the Earth. So they're a pair. I'm thinking of them as a pair.
Yes.
But I haven't drawn any conclusions yet.
So my Lilith is there in the 7th house.
Your Lilith is, yes, conjunct your ascendant and conjunct my Venus.
Yes.
Yeah. So then the third and final way that I look at a chart, well, no, it's not the final way actually, but here we get, kind of super crazy with all sorts of weird and wonderful squiggles.
A lot of those are asteroids.
Yeah, many asteroids. There's part of Spirit there, part of Fortune's in there somewhere. Here are some of the dwarf planets like Maki Maki, Gong Gong. I think this one is Pholus, a centaur, Ixion, Quaori. I also throw the Pluto Chiron midpoint in there as well.
So
So that's
what tends
interesting,
to,
being
what
conjunct
tends
to
to,
the galactic center.
yes, what tends to bring out or emphasize any one of these is when it's in a very close aspect
Yeah,
to something else.
it does. Yeah, particularly the conjunctions and oppositions.
This thing here in my eighth house,
Mm-hmm.
that 819 Aries and 825 Aries.
Yeah, that's Astraea,
Uh-huh. Yes.
one of the asteroids.
Uh-huh.
What was the other one?
Right after it, yeah.
Yeah, that's the part of spirit.
Ah,
So as you know,
what is,
there are different ways of working with this part of spirit. There's a day calculation and a night calculation. So
yes.
um,
Do you use the part of bad luck?
I don't.
I love that point.
There are so many. There are so many lots.
Yeah.
As you
Yeah.
know, that there's more than enough for an ordinary brain to take in on the screen at the moment.
Yes.
But that
Yes.
actually isn't the way that I completely. That's not the final way that I look at a chart these days, because my latest experiment, I'll go back to here, is to also look at the sidereal chart.
Oh my.
Yeah. So here we can create a bi-wheel with your natal chart, your tropical chart on the inside, the
Now, what do you,
sidereal on the outside.
what do you, do you ever look up the degree symbols for
Of
the
course.
sidereal position?
Absolutely.
And what do you feel like those signify,
Well,
generally speaking?
Well, generally speaking, I think the idea that the sidereal chart tends to be prominent in public figures makes sense to me. There are numerous examples of that where there's not perhaps too much apparently going on in a tropical chart, but when you put up the sidereal chart, it makes a lot more sense. So it tends to be associated by some astrologers with people who have a strong contribution to society.
Mm-hmm.
But then we can also put up the draconic chart. There's a third wheel. So this is another area of great interest to me.
That's the draconic chart, the one.
Yeah. So the draconic chart is calculated by.
That's the outside wheel there.
It's the outside wheel now, and it's calculated by the difference between the north node and the first degree of Aries.
Right.
So someone who has their north node in the first degree of Aries will have a very similar draconic chart.
Yeah.
Which could be looked at as suggesting that that person has the potential to fully live their soul purpose, if we take the draconic chart as being related to soul purpose. Whereas someone who has the opposite of that may find it more difficult to express soul purpose. But what's interesting to do is when you've got the three up, I actually sometimes use the heliocentric chart as well. But so there's that's a fourth circle. But basically these three circles here, if you look at where they line up, then perhaps it's possible to draw some conclusions. So
yes,
just quickly looking. Don't think I've done this for your chart, but can you see anything that's close? I mean, draconic Mercury is close to sidereal Sun, for instance.
Yes. Well, my draconic Pluto is pretty close to an opposition to my Jupiter.
Yeah. Yeah.
I was noticing that one.
Yes, indeed. 28 Gemini. Yeah. So yeah, it's fascinating to see how they line up. I haven't done much of this, but I did come across a chart where there was a phenomenal number of alignments,
Yes.
which kind of suggested to me, given the circumstances behind that chart, that it was almost as if in coming to their pre-incarnational soul contract, they'd given themselves just too much to deal with.
Yes.
But it's fascinating to speculate in those kinds of ways. But as time has gone on, I felt a lot more comfortable with my understanding that we are a soul in spiritual incarnation, that we have a past which may be happening now. It may all be happening now, or we can play with sequential lives as well. But
yes,
there's more to this life than meets the eye, I think.
Oh yes. Well,
and astrology, as you know, can help point us in some interesting directions.
Yeah, and I think it can, one of the major things it reveals is what's the workings of our own inner world.
Yeah.
Well, and that's the world on which the outer world is based.
Yeah.
Materialists think of it the other way around.
Yeah.
But
sure. Yeah.
Yes. Well, I've really enjoyed this talk. This has been great.
It's always great to talk with you, John. It's always.
Yes, and I hope we get to do more of this in the future.
Yeah, that'll be wonderful. Yeah.
Yes. And as usual, you've given me a whole lot of things that I want to pursue, that I want to think about more.
And it's been a great pleasure, John. Just to quickly conclude, I've noticed that my progressed moon is moving from the 30th degree of Cancer into the 1st degree of Leo on July the 31st, when there's an alignment of Uranus, Mars, and the North Node. So I'm thinking maybe I'm about to emerge out of my Cancerian shell and be more out in the public, but we'll see. Thanks again.
That would be great. Well, thank you, and we'll talk again soon. So I'm John Sandbach. My website is johnsandbach.net, and I'm on Instagram and TikTok as well. So look for me there, and I hope you're going to be seeing more of Paul too.
That's possible.
Thank you very much, Paul. This is great.